Podcast show notes are more than a quick summary. A brief summary of each episode is just scratching the surface. Your episode show notes can provide a lot more value for your company's podcast.
Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Podcasts are more than an audio channel, and it's easy to get excited about creating cover art, building podcast episode trailers, and creating social posts. But from my experience, many companies don't spend enough time on one of the most basic elements of their show: their podcast show notes. I usually see companies treat podcast show notes as an afterthought. It's something quickly entered into a podcast hosting platform right before you publish an episode. So why are podcast show notes so important? When you create show notes for each episode, it serves as the foundation for a lot of repurposed content. If you take the time to document a quality summary of an episode, you provide the information needed for assets like your podcast episode trailer, your video clips, audiograms, social images and posts, featured articles, or blog posts. So if show notes are so important, why are companies failing to produce them effectively? In my opinion, the answer is there's not a clear framework. So in this episode, I'm going to outline all the sections you need and provide you with a solid podcast show notes template. So here are the 10 things that we encourage our customers to include on their podcast show notes page: the episode title, an episode summary, the guest information, key themes, episode highlights, the full-length episode, promotional videos, links to subscribe, resources, and additional podcast episodes. So let's start with number 1. Generating interest with a clear episode title. The podcast episode title should be clear and to the point. It's not the place to be creative. Save that for your summary, which we're going to get into in a second. Your goal with the title is to let your listeners know what they can expect from the episode. And if you're producing a podcast for your company, it's all about the episode and how it will help your customer or your ideal listener. The best podcast episode titles generate curiosity and make people want to listen. So don't get too cute with it. You won't believe what happens next, or leaving some sort of cliffhanger. Be straightforward and use keywords that are going to help people find your show in search engines, podcast listening apps, or sites like Listen Notes or Podchaser. Using something that is going to say, hey, listener, if you listen to this episode, this is what you're going to get out of it. All right, so on to number 2. Enticing your audience with a short episode summary. The podcast episode summary gives readers a taste of what they'll get with the full episode, and it gives your audience a clear reason to hit the play button. When writing a podcast episode summary, it helps to come up with a framework you can reuse each time. I like to use the and, but, therefore, ABT structure when producing an episode description for recorded content. The ABT structure is a format for creating compelling stories. It includes all of the core elements of business storytelling wrapped up in a 3-part sequence. We actually featured the creator of the ABT structure, Park Howell, on this show. During the episode, Park talks about how the ABT structure can be used for a lot of applications, especially a podcast. And you'll be able to find a link to that episode of this show on the show notes page of this episode. A little bit meta there that I'm talking about show notes and saying, hey, where are you going to find resources but in the episode page of this episode? Anyway, next we have highlighting your guest's background. That's if you have a guest, of course. If you have guests on your company's podcast, it's important to include their information in the show notes. This includes their name, title, company, and a brief bio. You can also include links to their website or social media profiles. If you're talking to multiple guests, make sure to list them all in the show notes. This will help listeners know who they'll hear from on the show. Okay, number 4. Highlighting key themes from the episode. After you've given an overview of the episode, it's time to get into the meat of the show. In this section, you'll want to highlight the major themes covered during the conversation. Try to limit this section to 3 major themes or paragraphs. All right, number 5. Document specific parts of the conversation with episode highlights. In this section, you'll want to list out specific moments from the episode. The bullet points can include memorable quotes, resources mentioned, or other main talking points. For the most part, episode highlights are listed in chronological order. This allows your listeners to see how the conversation unfolds and gives them a chance to skip ahead to a memorable episode quote. All right, we're moving on to the sixth thing. Providing access to the full-length episode in multiple formats. When you create a dedicated page for each episode on your website, provide access to the full content. This can be in the form of an embedded YouTube video or an embedded MP3, often provided by your podcast hosting platform. This allows your website visitors to consume the entire episode using their preferred format. We're not forcing them to listen to an audio file in an app they may not use, like Spotify or Apple. They may listen on Listen Notes or Google Podcast or something else. Since we mostly produce video podcasts at Motion, we usually build a large header section on the page with the title and the full video on YouTube. On to item 7. Give your audience a dynamic preview with a promotional video. If you have a podcast promo video, you should also include that in the show notes. This is a great way to give listeners a preview of what they can expect from the podcast. When we create custom show notes pages, we tend to embed a promo video within the page's main content area. Often the promo video supports one of the key themes illustrated in the episode. So we usually embed the promo video before or after you list out the key themes. Number 8, make it easy for people to subscribe to your podcast. One of the primary goals of your company's show is to build loyal podcast listeners. So it's important to provide easy access to your show and list the major places someone can listen to the episode. Include links to subscribe to your podcast on the major platforms like Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Play. You can also include RSS feed information for people who want to add your podcast manually and listen to the episode in their favorite podcast app. Okay, moving on to number 9. Include additional resources mentioned in the episode. When you have a conversation, the host and guest typically cover various resources throughout the episode. In some cases, the guest provides valuable websites for the audience, and in other cases, the guest even provides a specific call to action for the listeners. To make additional resources easily accessible for your audience, provide a list of books, websites, articles, or anything else that would be helpful. And lastly, provide access to additional episodes. If you have additional episodes of the podcast, make sure to include them in the show notes. This will help listeners find more episodes that they might be interested in. Podcast show notes are more than a quick summary. A brief summary of each episode is just scratching the surface. Your episode show notes can provide a lot more value for your company's podcast. After you build out a dedicated podcast show notes page for each episode, you provide a dedicated home for every conversation. The show notes page becomes just as valuable as a blog post and can generate traffic. And after you take the time to write great podcast show notes, it helps serve as a starting point for other assets such as videos, images, social posts, and more. By the way, if you'd like to see how we assemble our very own podcast show notes, take a look at our podcast we produce on our shows tab at motionagency.io. Just click our shows. That's all for this episode of Recorded Content. I appreciate you tuning in.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.